Contingency planning. So in Alaska, we have a combined federal and state preparedness plan for response to oil and hazardous substance discharges and releases, also known as the Unified Plan. The Unified Plan gives general guidance for pollution response throughout the whole state of Alaska, and as you can see on this slide here, then the state is divided into 10 sub-areas. And there's a plan for each of those sub-areas with geographically specific guidance on pollution response for that individual area. And you can see that there is a plan for the Aleutian Islands where we are today. So within the Unified Plan, again, which is for the whole state of Alaska, there's an Annex F for chemical countermeasures, dispersants, chemical agents, and other spill mitigating substances, devices, or technology. So Annex F provides guidance on selecting the appropriate response technology and tools in Alaska and ensures a variety of response tools are available to the on-scene coordinator. So the on-scene coordinator is a person who's responsible for deciding how to respond to a spill, and we have two of them today. We have Captain Albertson, who spoke earlier, and Mr. Merrill, who is an on-scene coordinator for the state. So the tools that are available within this annex, there's three primary. First is mechanical recovery of oil, such as skimming of oil off the water surface. There's in situ burning, where the oil is corralled and burned in place. And finally is the use of dispersants to disperse the oil in the water. So within Annex F, there's an Appendix 1, and that is the dispersant use plan for Alaska, which is what we're talking about today. And the most recent revision was signed on January 27th of 2016 and replaced all previous versions. And when this dispersant use plan was developed, there were meetings like this one in Alaska where we came out to communities in 2013 and presented information about dispersant use, and that public input was incorporated into this plan that we have today. So the dispersant use plan does a number of things. It outlines a process to be used following oil discharge when dispersants are being considered. It establishes two areas for the state of Alaska. One is a pre-authorized area, and the other is undesignated areas. I'll go into more detail on what those are later. It also pre-authorizes the federal on-scene coordinator to move dispersant response tools toward the pre-authorization area if conditions warrant. But I'd like to note that the plan pre-authorizes the federal on-scene coordinator to make an independent decision to mobilize dispersants, but it doesn't mean that dispersants are required to be used in the pre-authorization area. Having this plan allows for results in a regulated dispersant response capability. And then it also provides a framework to identify dispersant use avoidance areas with an initial 24-month deadline to define those within the pre-authorization area. And that's why we are here speaking with you today. So the dispersant plan gives some general guidance to the federal on-scene coordinator when they're considering use of dispersants. They should consider the challenges specific to Alaska, two of those being the long distances and limited resources. You need to consider the characteristics of oil and the characteristics of dispersed oil and how they're different, how they affect the environment. You need to consider valuable commercial subsistence and recreational fisheries in the area, large and important populations of fish and wildlife, and any threatened and endangered species that could be affected. The federal on-scene coordinator should also ask key questions. Will the selected dispersant work effectively on the oil discharge in the given circumstances? Can the dispersant be effectively applied to this specific oil discharge? And what are the environmental trade-offs of dispersant use? And do they support the use of the dispersant in this given circumstance? And finally, the plan encourages the on-scene coordinator to consider that every oil spill is different. They each need to be measured on their own merits, and the appropriate tool needs to be used for that specific spill. So the dispersant use plan was developed.
The following participants have entered the conference. No names are available.
Just ask.
Who just joined? Welcome. Thank you for calling in. So if you're looking at the presentations, we're on our first presentation on policy, and we're looking at slide number 6 on dispersant use authorizations. So this dispersant use plan is developed in accordance with the national plan. There's a National Oil and Hazardous Substances Pollution Contingency Plan, or NCP. And in that plan, it says that dispersant use by a federal on-scene coordinator under a pre-authorization plan is allowed with the pre-approval of the EPA, State of Alaska Department of Environmental Conservation, U.S. Department of Interior, and Department of Commerce Natural Resource trustees. And in this plan, we have that pre-approval. For areas that are not in the pre-authorized plan, the on-scene coordinator may authorize the use of dispersants only with concurrence from the EPA and ADEC after consultation with natural resource trustees. However, the federal on-scene coordinator may authorize use of dispersants without concurrence to prevent or substantially reduce hazard to human life. And once that hazard has been eliminated, then we go back to the other two processes. So this is the pre-authorization area. It commences at Cape Suckling on the east and ends at Cape Sarachev after it goes up and around the ocean chain. And you'll see that it's pinned to the shore of those two locations. And the intent of that is to prevent tanker vessels from transiting the pre-authorization area by going behind it. But the pre-authorization area itself starts 24 nautical miles offshore. On the south side, it goes from 24 nautical miles, which corresponds to the contiguous zone on a nautical chart, and goes out to the 200 nautical mile line, which is the exclusive economic zone, or EEZ line. And then it travels west out to the maritime boundary line, international line, and then it goes to 100 nautical miles north of the Aleutian chain and travels east to where it ends. The pre-authorization area crosses 5 of the 10 sub-areas that I showed you earlier, 5 of the 10 out for Alaska, that exist in the Unified Plan. And going from east to west, it touches Prince William Sound, Cook Inlet, Kodiak Island, Bristol Bay, and the Aleutian Islands sub-areas. And we have been going out to those different sub-areas during this process to gather public input. We had a meeting in Valdez for Prince William Sound, one in Kenai for Cook Inlet, one in Kodiak City for Kodiak, and then this meeting in Dutch Harbor is for the Bristol Bay and for the Aleutian Islands sub-areas. We also spent 2 days at the Bureau of Indian Affairs Providers Conference in Anchorage and had a table there to speak with the federally recognized tribes there and to tell them about this process and ask for their input. Prior to the approval of this dispersant use plan, we did conduct an Endangered Species Act Section 7 consultation with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the National Marine Fisheries Service. And as a result, several avoidance areas were already created in the pre-authorization area to account for the high concentrations of short-tailed albatross and North Pacific right whale critical habitat. And we do have a graphic of those areas later in Dr. Johnson's presentation I will show you. So having a pre-authorization area does a number of things. First, it ensures that the Coast Guard can require vessels and facility plan holders to maintain a minimum dispersant use capability, which means they have to have dispersant available in the state and be ready to use it. And that's in accordance with 33 Code of Federal Regulations, Parts 154 and 155. This includes tank vessels that carry crude oil and stop at one or more U.S. ports during transit. And vessels and facilities must comply within 24 months from publication of the Federal Register Notice, which is dated 9th of February 2016. The boundaries of the pre-authorization area are based on the location of common shipping routes that are followed by regulated crude oil vessels. And having the inner boundary of the pre-authorization zone 24 nautical miles offshore excludes nearshore sensitive areas. And it's worth noting that most of the pre-authorization areas in the lower 48 start at 3 nautical miles offshore. Alaska's is 8 times that distance to protect those nearshore sensitive areas. So this plan requires us to be here today, to come and speak with you. So the Coast Guard Federal On-Scene Coordinator, the EPA On-Scene Coordinator, and the State On-Scene Coordinator are to engage federal, state, and natural resource trustees, federally recognized tribes and stakeholders to identify dispersant use avoidance areas. Once we do that, those identified locations are going to be added to Section 1 of each sub-area contingency plan. So within Bristol Bay and the Aleutian Islands sub-area contingency plans, there's going to be a special section called Dispersant Use Avoidance Areas that will include those areas that will be used by responders whenever there is an oil spill. When we set up an avoidance area in the pre-authorization area, it's reclassified as an undesignated area. And we have to complete this process within 24 months after the plan was approved. So we have until January of 2018 to complete this process. And if it's not completed within the 24 months, any pre-authorized area within that sub-area is removed as pre-authorized area until the process is completed. So it would remain an undesignated area. So an avoidance area does not exclude an area from potential use of dispersants. It means that a case-by-case authorization process will be used in that area. And I'm going to go into those processes on a later slide. Okay, so what is an undesignated area? So an undesignated area is all marine waters in Alaska outside of pre-authorization area. And marine waters are all waters that go from the coast of Alaska out to 200 nautical miles. So federally recognized tribes and stakeholders may recommend avoidance areas in the undesignated area during this public comment period for future consideration. But please note that this current effort is primarily to collect input on the pre-authorization area avoidance areas to meet a 24-month deadline that was imposed by the regional response team. However, we will take comments on the undesignated areas for review in a future process. Also, I'd like to note that this is the first effort in identifying these avoidance areas. Future revisions to all avoidance areas will be conducted during routine sub-area contingency plan updates as we go forward. So the dispersant use plan includes policies, considerations, and stipulations for dispersant use. First, mechanical recovery is the primary method to be used. Dispersants are an alternative when mechanical and in-situ burning are infeasible, ineffective, or insufficient. Dispersant delivery will not interfere with mechanical recovery. A pre-authorization area only applies to crude oil. And dispersant effectiveness field tests will be conducted with smart monitoring with specific resources and timelines with daily analysis. And for those that aren't familiar, SMART stands for Special Monitoring of Applied Response Technologies. And this involves visual observations, sampling, and testing of the water column to ascertain real-time efficacy of dispersant application. So when we're considering using of dispersants, we have to look at incident-specific trade-offs, and it's based on complex variables. So some of the things that are going to be looked at are bathymetry or water depth of the area, the distance from shore, the mixing energy present from either wind and waves, salinity and temperature of the water, the available response equipment, weather, sea conditions, and shoreline types, sensitive habitats and species, along with protected areas, historic properties, subsistence use activities, fishing and boating, and public and private facilities such as water intakes. Further conditions and stipulations include that dispersants are only to be applied during daylight hours. The water in the area has to be deeper than 10 fathoms or 60 feet and beyond sensitive nearshore and benthic habitats. There has to be a minimum of 500-meter horizontal separation from swarming fish, rafting bird flocks, marine mammals in the water, or at haul-outs. Monitoring and surveying by scientific specialists is required, as was mentioned earlier with smart technology. All dispersant locations or areas where dispersants are used have to be provided to the public. The plan goes on to provide tools to responding agencies. First is it outlines two different processes. There's a process for dispersant use in the pre-authorization area, and then there's a process for case-by-case dispersant use. And then there are checklists to go through those processes. There's a dispersant use request. There's a checklist to identify resources at risk. There's an authorization checklist, and then there's documentation of that authorization. Anytime dispersants are used, there has to be an after-action report submitted. And at the back of the plan, it specifically outlines how to conduct a SMART protocol, and it also talks about environmental monitoring for atypical dispersant operations. An atypical would be a subsea application or a full-scale application greater than 96 hours. So if you look at the plan, the two processes, they look very similar, but there are some key differences. Within the pre-authorization area, the Federal On-Scene Coordinator is able to direct the responsible party, or the RP, to mobilize resources for dispersant use, so that you can start moving those dispersants toward the oil spill. If there's no responsible party, the Federal On-Scene Coordinator may direct the resource mobilization, even without the RP. And all entities are notified during this process. The EPA, Department of Interior, Department of Commerce, the state, tribes, and stakeholders. And all of the checklists in the plan are still filled out. In the case-by-case method, the responsible party or the Federal On-Scene Coordinator, there is no responsible party, submits a dispersant use request to those same agencies and entities. The Federal On-Scene Coordinator may still mobilize dispersants even in the case-by-case method, depending on timing and need to move quickly just to get it toward the scene. This process for case-by-case dispersant authorization is used in specific circumstances. So for discharges of any type of oil in an undesignated area, so any area outside the pre-authorization area or in avoidance area within that pre-authorization area. For discharges of any type of oil other than crude oil, that's the case-by-case method in any area. In the event it is not possible due to logistical, weather, or sea conditions, as confirmed or determined by the Federal On-Scene Coordinator, to conduct SMART Tier 2 or 3 monitoring in the pre-authorization area, so taking water samples on scene. And if there's any atypical use of dispersants, or any use of dispersants subsea in the pre-authorization area. And for discharges of crude oil in a pre-authorization area within 24 months following the signing of the plan. So that's important to note, because right now, although a pre-authorization area has been defined, it's not in effect right now. It doesn't go into effect until 24 months after this plan was signed, so that'll be January of 2018. And then it's only once the Federal On-Scene Coordinator has approved the avoidance areas within the pre-authorization area. So the pre-authorization area process and the case-by-case process has a number of commonalities. Both of the processes involve tribes and stakeholders. In both processes, all checklists are completed within the plan. Both address Endangered Species Act and essential fish habitat consultations. Both require field tests before full-scale application, and both require SMART Tier 1 through 3 monitoring. So visual observation that dispersants are being effective and testing of the water column to make sure that they are effective. So in conclusion, the dispersant use plan for Alaska outlines a process that carefully weighs the trade-offs involved in dispersant use following the spill. This area is beyond nearshore sensitive areas, but may still contain avoidance areas where the case-by-case dispersant use authorization process should be used. And we are here today to ask for your help to identify any avoidance areas by submitting your comments for review by our technical committee. The technical committee will recommend avoidance areas to the on-scene coordinators for approval, and approved avoidance areas will be included in the sub-area contingency plans. So that concludes the presentation on the plan itself. I'm glad to take any questions on the plan, but I'd also like to remind you that the other presentations we're going to have on science of dispersants and the process itself. So if you have questions about the science or the public comment process, I ask that you save those until after those presentations, because I think they may answer a lot of your questions. But is there any questions about the dispersant use plan? Yes, sir.
What are the facility requirements?
The facility requirements, I don't have the specifics on that. I can get those for you. Other than that they're required to have a certain capability on hand. Let me research that and get back to you. Thank you for that question. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Where will you be storing the dispersants?
Right now, there are only two places for dispersants in Alaska. One is the Belize, and the other one's Anchorage. There are no plans to move them elsewhere.
Right.
Well, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
The question was, where would dispersants be housed? And I mentioned, this is Rick Burkhardt, I mentioned that there are only two places in Alaska with dispersants right now. One is Valdez, and the other one's Anchorage, and that there are no plans to move dispersants anywhere else. The dispersant use plan requires that a spiller be able to mobilize dispersants within 8 hours of having that decision to do so. And so really exactly where they're located isn't quite as important as having them in theater and being able to to mobilize them in that time frame. That's the way we looked at it.
I'm just wondering, let's say they're in Valdez, or how are they going to mobilize to get out here in a timely manner, I guess is the question.
There are two primary deployment methods. One is by vessel, and of course that's going to take a long time to get out here. The other one is by aircraft. There are what we call these ADS packages. It's just usually you would attach them onto a C-130, but there are other aircraft that can accommodate the ADS package. And so the primary source out here would probably be by a larger plane like that.
Thank you. Any other questions? Okay, thank you very much. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Catherine Burr from NOAA.
Thank you. This one?
Yes.
Okay.
He's bringing your presentation.
Yep. Okay. So, good afternoon. My name is Catherine Gard. I'm with NOAA's Office of Response and Restoration, Emergency Response Division.